All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at this excerpt. It's called Chosen One. From now on, it is God's duty richness forever.
Wow.
Yeah, quite a title, huh?
Yeah. It's
It makes some pretty big promises right off the bat.
it does. It does.
And it's really got me thinking. I'm curious to dig into it. So this excerpt, it's interesting because it addresses the reader, directly. It calls them Chosen One. And it talks about God kind of like personally ensuring your wealth.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your initial thoughts on this idea of wealth being like a spiritual inheritance. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, the first thing that jumps out at me is how it sort of like reframes how we think about getting wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily about hard work or luck or any of those things that we usually attribute it to, but it's actually like a divine right, a reflection of God's love.
Okay, so like it's almost like built into the plan for you if you're one of the chosen people.
Right, exactly. It's and that's a very different way of looking at it than, what we normally hear.
Yeah, for sure. And the excerpt even uses this analogy I thought was interesting that talks about divine provision being like a river that's constantly flowing.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious about that because doesn't that paint like kind of a passive picture? Like we just sort of like sit on the riverbank and wait for the money to flow by.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the river analogy definitely evokes that kind of abundance, right? Like it's constantly flowing, there's always enough. But the excerpt does also talk about the importance of obedience.
Yeah.
It's not just about sitting back and waiting.
Right.
It's about aligning your actions with God's will.
Okay.
So maybe there's a little bit more to it than just passively receiving. It's about positioning yourself to receive those blessings.
Right. So like taking action, there's some personal responsibility in there.
Exactly. There's this interplay between like divine grace and human agency. Yeah. It makes me think of the parable of the talents.
Oh, right.
You remember that one? Where the people who use their talents wisely are rewarded with even more.
Yeah.
So it's maybe about recognizing and using what God has already provided to create more.
Yeah, like working with it.
Yeah.
Not just expecting it to just fall into your lap.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So then there's this idea of trust, which the excerpt really underlines.
Mm-hmm.
It even suggests that looking back at past blessings, that can be like proof of God's faithfulness, and that should help people worry less about money.
Right.
But I wonder, what about, I think everyone's been in those situations where things are tight. Like what about those times when things are tough?
Yeah.
How does this idea of God always providing, how does that hold up when you're really struggling?
Right. Well, I think that's where this idea could maybe raise some eyebrows for people.
Yeah.
Because, some might say if you just trust completely in God to take care of your finances, you might just become complacent.
Right. You might just sort of sit back and not do anything.
Exactly. And not really put in any personal effort.
Right. So I guess the question is, how do you balance those two things?
Yeah.
Like we're supposed to trust God, but we're also supposed to be responsible.
Exactly. And it's a bit of a tricky balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think maybe it's about acknowledging that trusting God doesn't mean we don't have to make smart choices or be responsible.
Okay.
It's more about approaching decisions with a sense of confidence.
Yeah.
That he's there to help.
Right. So maybe like instead of stressing about every financial detail, you kind of like come at it with the understanding that God's got it ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. It's about like aligning your thinking with that belief.
Okay.
That you're taken care of. And then that influences how you go about things.
And I guess that kind of leads into this other point about giving. Mm-hmm. This excerpt talks about giving as a way to kind of create more space for God's blessings.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that definitely challenges a lot of like our traditional views on giving.
Yeah.
Because we usually see it as kind of like a transaction.
Mm-hmm.
You give something to get something back, or you get to earn God's favor.
Right.
But here it's more about it being like an act of faith.
Oh.
Like letting go of what you have to make room for more to come in.
So it's almost like saying, okay, I trust that there's enough to go around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's about abundance.
So I can share freely.
And, I think that's a powerful concept, especially for people who maybe struggle with feeling unworthy.
Oh, interesting.
Which is, a lot of people when it comes to finances.
Right.
But the excerpt kind of flips that on its head and reminds us that God doesn't choose us based on like how good we are.
Right.
He chooses us because he chooses us.
Yeah, I want you. That's it.
Exactly. So even if you don't think you deserve it, it's a gift, not something you earned.
Right. And maybe giving is a way of aligning with that flow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like you're saying, I trust that the source is bigger than me,
So I can share.
and I'm open to receiving more.
Okay, so we've got this foundation now, this wealth as a spiritual inheritance.
Right?
And we've got this idea of trust and generosity all kind of interwoven.
Yeah.
But there's more to unpack here. There's some deeper stuff in this excerpt. So in the next part, let's delve into those a little bit more.
Yeah, let's do it.
Some of the more nuanced things that jumped out at me.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that really stood out to me in this excerpt is how it kind of expands on what we think of when we think of wealth.
Okay.
It's not just about the money. It talks about peace, joy, purpose, all these things. It's like a whole state of being.
Right. Like true wealth is more than just your bank account.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about having abundance in like every part of your life.
Mm-hmm. So how does that tie in with this idea of wealth as a testimony? Like the excerpt talks about your prosperity. It should inspire other people to, seek God.
Right. Well, it's like, it's not just about showing off your money. It's about like your whole life being a reflection of God's blessings.
Okay.
You're radiating that peace and joy and purpose.
Yeah.
And that's what attracts people.
But wouldn't that also invite a lot of scrutiny? I mean, some people might be like, oh, you think you've got it all figured out, especially when it comes to money.
Oh, for sure. And the excerpt actually addresses that.
Does it?
Yeah, it encourages you to basically rise above those criticisms.
Okay.
Focus on what God's promising you rather than worrying about what other people think.
So stay true to your own experience, even if other people don't get it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. But how do you balance that with, humility is a big thing in faith.
Right.
So how do you balance hey, I'm blessed
Yeah.
with not being arrogant about it?
That is a tricky balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because on one hand, you're supposed to embrace your chosen status and enjoy those blessings, but you don't want to be boastful about it. I think it comes back to remembering that it's not about you.
Oh, okay.
Your
yeah.
blessings are a gift.
Okay.
Humility is acknowledging that.
So celebrate it, but remember where it came from.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Now, this excerpt also mentions this concept of divine timing.
Yeah.
It talks about seasons of waiting and sowing and reaping and really trusting in God's process. But how do you explain that to someone who's really struggling financially and feels like I've been waiting forever for my breakthrough?
Yeah, I think a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah.
And it's hard because divine timing doesn't always match our own timelines.
Right.
So it takes a lot of trust, to surrender to that, to believe God's working, even when you don't see it.
So it's not just sitting around and waiting. It's actively doing what you can, but trusting that the bigger picture is in God's hands.
Right, exactly. It's like recognizing that there's different seasons for everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's times to plant, times to nurture, times to harvest. And you got to stay faithful through all of them, knowing that God's timing is perfect even when it doesn't feel like it.
Right. Okay. And then the excerpt takes it even a step further.
Yeah.
Talking about this eternal inheritance. It's it's not just about you. It's about generations. It's about this flow of blessings that goes beyond your lifetime.
Right.
That's a powerful thought, but what does that even mean practically?
Yeah, I think it speaks to the idea that our choices have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Like what we do today affects not just us, but our kids and their kids.
Okay.
So it's about building something that lasts, a legacy of faith and generosity and abundance.
So it's not just about accumulating stuff for yourself.
Right.
It's about using what you have to make a positive impact.
Exactly. It's shifting the focus from the short term to the long term.
Right.
True wealth is about way more than just stuff.
Right. It's a legacy.
Yeah, it's about love and purpose and abundance that just keeps on going.
Right. So we've got this expanded idea of wealth, this divine timing, and this eternal inheritance. But let's get real here. How do you actually live this out? It's one thing to talk about it.
Yeah.
But how do you actually put this idea of God providing into practice in your everyday life? Especially when things are tough. It's easy to talk about trusting and abundance and all that, but how do you actually do it when things get real?
Right.
When life throws you a curveball, how do you reconcile that with this idea that God's always got you covered?
Yeah, I think that's where the real test is, isn't it? It's easy to have faith when everything's going great,
Right.
but when things are tough, that's when you really see what your trust is made of.
So it's not like the challenges just disappear when
Right.
you adopt this mindset. It's more about how you approach them.
Yeah, exactly. And, the excerpt, it's bold, but it's not naive.
Okay.
It doesn't pretend that challenges don't exist. But it does say that with God as your provider, you'll always have what you need.
Okay, so even in the tough times.
Even in the tough times.
Yeah.
It's almost like it reframes those challenges like they're opportunities.
Opportunities. How do you see a challenge, especially like a financial one, as an opportunity?
Well, think about it. Like, let's say you have a financial setback.
Hmm.
That could force you to kind of step back and look at what's really important.
Okay.
You might have to get creative, Maybe you discover some skills you didn't even know you had.
So instead of freaking out like, God's abandoned me,
Right.
you look for the lesson, the hidden blessing in the struggle.
Exactly. It's changing your perspective.
Yeah.
From why me to what am I learning here?
Okay.
Trusting that God's using this to refine you, to get you ready for even bigger things.
So it's like that trust is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And remember, the excerpt says God takes personal responsibility for you. So even when things are really rough, you're not in it alone.
That is a comforting thought. I mean, I think everyone can relate to feeling overwhelmed by money sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
But how does this mindset, this idea of God's got me, how does that actually change things?
Well, it changes your energy. For one thing, instead of fear and scarcity, you're coming from a place of abundance.
Okay.
Knowing God's resources are unlimited. That opens you up to new possibilities. Maybe you take risks you wouldn't have before.
So it's not about just like wishing for a miracle. It's about actually doing something, but with that belief backing you up.
Exactly. It's aligning your actions with your faith. And remember, it's not just about money.
Right.
It's everything. Relationships, health, your purpose, all of it. When you really believe God's got your back, it gives you this peace and freedom.
Right, to actually thrive.
Yeah.
So it goes back to that idea of true wealth being more than just dollars and cents.
Absolutely. It's about reflecting God's blessings in every part of your life.
Wow. This has been a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
I mean, we've covered a lot, this idea of wealth and provision, in a way that, honestly, I hadn't really thought about before. It definitely challenges some of the conventional wisdom, and maybe even raises more questions than answers.
That's true.
But I think that's a good thing. It makes you think outside the box,
Absolutely.
Consider possibilities beyond what you thought was possible.
It pushes you to go deeper.
Exactly. So as we wrap up, I think it's worth really sitting with these ideas.
Yeah.
If God really has taken on the responsibility for your well-being, for your abundance, how does that change things for you? What would you do differently? How would you use your resources?
It's a great question to consider.
It is. And hopefully, maybe this has given you a new perspective on abundance, or maybe just, a little more trust, or at least a desire to learn more.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, I hope you're leaving with a sense of hope and that feeling that anything's possible.
Me too.
That there's this incredible love and abundance out there just waiting for us.
Absolutely.